Hello. Today we're going to talk about jQuery. So, I'm a pretty big fan of jQuery. I wish we were going to spend more time on jQuery, but today we're going to cover how to get started with it, how to use it basically, and whether you want to get good at this and use it more is up to you. I'm just kind of giving you the tools to get started. I'm going to do some kind of intermediate things and some basic things. I will be using jQuery in other applications as we go forward in the course, like when we start doing Ajax and such. So this isn't going to go away. The other thing that you should know about this is, so this isn't everything at all, even close. But there's going to be some things in here that I'm not going to do examples of because they're going to be in the lab that you're going to complete this week. So I don't know how long this is going to be. I'm going to try and make it as brief as I can. I've got the canned examples like I did last week. I'm working on getting better at that. Unfortunately, I think the best way to do it would be to have a separate file for like every little thing I'm demoing, but then I'd have like 20 files, and I don't think that would go well either. So I'm going to go through this as fast as I can and show you examples when I can. And try and spend less time on the examples. That's my goal today. You got a pause button. Hopefully that'll work. I'm recording on some monitor from it's super old, so I hope that doesn't have any negative effect on things. All right, so I wasted 1 minute and 23 seconds of your time getting started. Let's get going with jQuery. So if you're going to use jQuery, I guess one of the first things to understand is that you're going to need to import it. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can either download it and put it on your host and link to it, much like you would link to a style sheet or something like that, or you can use a hosted library, like for example, Google has hosted libraries. So what that really means is Google has downloaded that package and they put it somewhere on the web, which is accessible to the world, and then they serve that up to people. Now those are Google servers. You can't beat Google servers in terms of availability, uptime and all that. So I generally use the Google hosted libraries. There are reasons you would maybe want to download those files from the jQuery website and host them on your own. Namely, you can very much customize the package, and the whole package of jQuery is pretty big. And by big, that means people are gonna have to download it, and it takes time. So if you wanted a very just stripped down minimal functionality to improve performance, maximize performance, perhaps you'd want to download a minified package. The other thing about it is this: it takes time. If you don't need jQuery, if all you're doing is some simple JavaScript, then don't use it because it's a resource that you're making people download. Sure, it gets cached and they might not actually download it in details like that, but if you don't need it, well, then don't use it. Just use JavaScript. The other thing that we're going to mess around with is the UI. So there's the core functionality of jQuery, and then there's the UI, which is for user interface tools. If you don't need those, then don't use them because they're even bigger than jQuery. But if you need them, well, you're going to need to get them separately. There's also the compressed and uncompressed. If you're serving up something to your users, you're going to use the compressed version. The compressed version has all the spaces removed from the source code, basically. So it's a smaller file, smaller download. However, if you're learning how to use jQuery and you actually want to look at the underlying what the heck is going on in that jQuery library, you would certainly want the uncompressed version because it's actually readable. So, if you want jQuery, you've got to import it. I'll show you when I get there. All right, so some things about jQuery. jQuery is JavaScript. It's a library built on top of it. Everything that you would ever do in JavaScript, it's still there. It's just jQuery set out to address the shortcomings of JavaScript. So JavaScript is an old language. Well, I guess it's 25 years old or so. Times have changed. So over the years, people decided that JavaScript could be improved, and jQuery is the product of that. When you write jQuery, it's going to be in between script tags. It's just like JavaScript. You could have JavaScript on one line and jQuery on the next line. It doesn't work quite perfectly like that exactly. I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, you certainly could have one line jQuery, one JavaScript, but there are some there's some issues you could run into because they are somewhat different. So confusing for us is the $ is the shortcut for jQuery. So like this right here, this is ultimately a selector, so $document, that would select the document. You could also write jQuery document. So the $ is a shorthand operator or shorthand for for writing the word jQuery. Nobody writes jQuery. Everyone always does dollar sign, which is easy. The problem is we write a lot of PHP, and in PHP that means you're declaring a variable. So that is legitimately kind of difficult, just because our background is in PHP. All right, so immediately what we're going to get into is when I talk about jQuery, I'm going to talk about what it's the equivalent of in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we care about that window on load event, and then if you do things the way I do them, you have some anonymous function call here, and so this is what happens when the DOM gets loaded. And this is generally where you bind events to form elements, because you can't bind something to something that doesn't exist or isn't loaded yet. So we do that in there. That's JavaScript. In jQuery, it looks like this. So $, which means we're talking jQuery. This set of parentheses for document. At this point, you're like, what the heck? Are you going to explain that? Pretty much. I think so, kind of, in a few slides. Long story short, that's a selector. And then so instead of .onload, it's .ready. Right? Like everything in jQuery is a little different. So when the DOM is loaded, I'm going to do this anonymous function call right here, and then I'm going to do some stuff. Now, the thing that's super difficult about this, and you will hate, there's pretty much no doubt that you will hate this when you're starting with it. Heck, I hate it still, but it's just like a necessary evil. Is notice this weird syntax here. So this is where I open up this call to a function called ready, and then inside of those parentheses, I'm doing an inline function. And then that set of curly braces right there belongs to that function. That's where those set of curly braces close. And then there's a closing parenthesis here, which seems super weird to have after your curly brace. But that actually belongs to that right there. And so you're going to do this a lot. When you're doing those anonymous functions and you're binding events, you're going to write this closing curly brace, closing parenthesis, semicolon. And that probably goes against every instinct that you have as a programmer, but it actually it's right. I mean, otherwise you're going to have this unclosed thing right here. And I think sometimes people put those backwards because it just seems more logical, but that doesn't work. So watch out for that. If you got some annoying syntax errors, and I don't exactly know what the message would be on that error, but it's something not closing or an unmatched parenthesis or something like that. It's probably that. All right, so here's my first jQuery page, and then I'll head over to my script in a minute here and show you. So this right here, here's that. They're roughly the equivalent of that JavaScript onload thing. So when the DOM is loaded, which is what this represents, anonymous function, I'm going to throw an alert for Leroy Jenkins. If you don't know what that's a reference to, you're on YouTube already. Go ahead and figure it out. So let me show you. Here's a realistic example of these things. So here's my source code. I want to point out some of the things I'm doing here. So here's that. Here's a link to that Google hosted library. Let me show you where that comes from. So if you want to start working with jQuery, and I'm already, I feel like this is a good video. I feel like I'm off to a good start, but I'm also like 8 minutes in. I haven't done anything that concerns me a little bit. So here, if I just go jQuery, here's the jQuery website. I could download the source from here, or I could go hosted library. And so where that link comes from is, so I go to developers.google. It's this reference here. They're hosting all the stuff all the common stuff a web developer might use. So I scroll on down, and Dojo, D3. I don't know what half these things are. Hammer.js, here's jQuery, right? So if I want jQuery 3, that's my link. Right? It's a set of script tags. It requires a resource. See, that is your first step in working with jQuery, is copying that and pasting that right here. If you don't do that, you don't have jQuery. You don't just have jQuery because you want jQuery. You have jQuery because you imported it, and that's what that looks like. These other two lines, that is for the jQuery UI, which I will not need until the very end of this demonstration. But to show you where those things came from, I scroll down a little bit. There's jQuery Mobile, jQuery UI. So you need both of those for jQuery UI. So there's my link to the resource. Well, actually, that's a style sheet, and that's the resource. You need both of those things. So it's a UI, right? UI meaning user interface, graphical elements. As you could probably, it might make sense to you, there's a style sheet associated with that. And you can edit that style sheet if you need to. I have before. It was not fun, but you might need to. So that's the UI tools, and unless you import those, you're not going to have access to them. All right, so that's a very important step is when you're starting out, make sure to get that, just have that script tag. You can copy and paste it. Then down in here, here's where I write my JavaScript and my jQuery, right? jQuery is JavaScript. Here's my script tags. I didn't really mean to show you the scope of that. That's irrelevant. Just plain Jane script tag. And then, you know, I am writing jQuery today, but I do want to illustrate to you that, look at that, that's just plain JavaScript. There's no reason you can't do JavaScript. Here's this page. Hello world, right? I'm writing jQuery today. That's all I'm really trying to talk about. But that's JavaScript right there. So let me show you some other things here. So the other thing, you got alerts, you got console. Those are two common ways for programmers to get some output. Console.log, this $document. What the heck is that? Ken, you haven't explained that worth anything. I'm not too worried about it because that's what you call a selector, and that's the next thing up. This is one of those conversations where there's some logical entry points, but I have to skip over some things to get started with it. But right here, I just kind of want to show you what this is. So console.log, whatever this is. I'm telling you, that is the way that I reference the document, like the root of the DOM. And there's that $sign operator, which means jQuery. I'll show you what this produces. Very not cool. I refresh. I get my annoying hello world. I did not save this, which is why I got nothing. You saw my console was empty. But now that I save it and I reload it, you'll see I get something down here in the console. So it worked. What does that accomplish? I don't know. You don't care about this. This is the root of the DOM. Who cares? But what it does prove is that this thing actually returns something. If I did like some nonsense like that, like an unrecognizable term, I think it'll say something like null or something. Right? Documents is not defined. So at this point, while I haven't done anything particularly constructive, this is how I can prove to you that jQuery is working. Now, like for example, I don't know what that's. I'm trying to break this somehow. I don't know. I actually don't know how to effectively break that tag other than by commenting it out. I just want to show you what this would look like if I didn't import jQuery. It'll say I don't know what it'll say, but saying reference, $sign is not defined, jQuery is not defined. See those things? Those are the indicator, and since this is day one of jQuery, that means that you didn't import jQuery. So if you're running into that, then it means you probably messed that up somehow. Maybe you didn't paste it right, or I don't know. I don't know what you would do, but just trying to show you how to get started. Let me see, is there anything else I wanted to show you? Oh, here's that other point I want to prove to you. So like I said, this $sign is a shorthand for jQuery. Here's me just writing jQuery, right? Same thing. And no one does this that I've ever seen, actually. I'm just showing you that it is a way to do something. You see I get the same output twice. And I think there's one more thing I wanted to show you here. I do not want to show you this hello world because I'm already sick of it. Let's just show you kind of a combination of JavaScript and jQuery because I don't exactly have slides dedicated to it. Notice right here, this looks a lot like the syntax for creating a JavaScript variable. It is. And this right here is what you call a jQuery selector. That's the next subject. Don't worry. It's the coolest thing about jQuery, in my opinion, is how we can select things. This is me, which is making a plain old JavaScript variable and assigning it something that I'm getting from jQuery. I'm trying to show you here that they are used together. Like the tools in jQuery are just, they work with JavaScript. And here's console.log. I don't really, I shouldn't talk about that yet. I won't. But I will soon enough. All right. Selectors and filters. So this is my favorite thing about JavaScript. jQuery. In JavaScript, when you want to select something, it's brutal, right? It's document.getElementById, and it's all case sensitive. You got to know your IDs, and how do you select something by class name and tag name, right? It depends how familiar are you with JavaScript, but you know, it's get element by ID if there's an ID. Get elements by tag name is another one. There's all these different functions for getting things. In jQuery, you've already kind of seen me do it. It's just in parentheses you write what you want. And this is exactly like it is in CSS. So if you are good at CSS, you're going to love this. If you're terrible at CSS, well, this is going to be a good opportunity for you to get better at CSS. And so you can select things however you want. You can select them by the ID, by class, by tag name. This, so this would select everything. And when you select something, jQuery returns an array of matching of the elements you want. So like if you selected P, it would grab all the paragraph tags and it would give them to you in an array. If you selected something with an ID, that array is only going to have one thing in it because that's how IDs work. I'll show you another example. I've got a few examples of this. So given this little page right here, let's say, so in JavaScript, if you wanted to get all the elements that are paragraphs, it'd be get elements by tag name. In jQuery, you just pass it this P. So it's $, meaning, hey, this is jQuery time. And then anything, so when you're going to see it, like almost everything's like this, but you'll do a $, a set of parentheses, and then the name of the selector. That's pretty easy, right? I pass it a P, and that means it's going to give me all the P tags. If you did a div, it would give you all the divs. If you did H1, it would give you all the H1s. So really easy way to select everything. Now, where things get a little messy, I guess, is that's a string. Now, you might recall in my example earlier when I was doing document, remember document? Document is not a string. Document, you just pass it in as the word. Every other selector is going to be treated like a string. I don't know if you're going to get any mileage out of that or not, but I'm trying to make that point. Now, if you want something that's an ID, you write a hashtag in front of it or a pound symbol. Now, that is straight rooted in CSS, right? When you think about when you're making a CSS rule for an ID, you put a pound sign in front of it. And that is how you indicate to jQuery that this thing is a ID. And if something is a class, you put a dot in front of it. So like if you did .a, that would be everything with a class of A. If you do like li.a, that would be every list item with a class of A. Now, if you're like, what are you talking about? Well, that probably tells me that you're not very fluent with CSS, and I really can't address that. But I'm telling you, the same way that you write those rules for CSS is the same way that you write selectors for jQuery. So if you are decent at writing CSS, you're gonna love these selectors. I think you will. I do, at least. And so you can select by class, by ID. You can select a tag with a class. In addition to that, you've also got, you've also got pseudo selectors. So like this very much is a question of your command of CSS, but there's like odd and even and first and last. So like li:1 would grab you the first thing in a list. Li last would give you the last thing in a list. There's odd and even. Now I don't know if you've messed around with these things before, but if you have written those more advanced CSS rules, I want you to know that those exist in the world of jQuery. So let me go back and do my little example. Well, not really. So I want to talk about selectors, and I'm telling you, selectors are one of my favorite thing about jQuery is how easy it is to select things. But I can't do any kind of a demonstration until we talk about like a way to alter them. So I'm going to show you the first thing I'm going to show you, which is this CSS. So let me show you what this looks like here. So I don't usually do slide presentation mode, so this is going to drive me crazy, but I thought it'd make better viewing for you folks. So $, and so this indicates a selector. So I'm selecting something called my ID. It's an ID, and I'm setting the CSS to some property, so some key value pairs like font weight bold. There's two ways of doing this. It's not, if you were to look at these two lines here, you're probably like, what's the difference? It's subtle. So the first one, I'm calling the CSS function, and I'm passing it like the property I want to set and the value I'm setting it to. Each one of those things is a string, and they need to be written the same way they'd be written in CSS, and that is a comma separating the values. This way down here, you are not, I don't know why you would prefer this. It's just more work, but it's the same selector, same function, but you notice there's curly braces, and in those curly braces, it's key value pairs separated by colons. This kind of drives me crazy because I tend to try and sometimes I put colons in the other one and commas in the other one. It's really easy to get those mixed up, but the difference is colons versus commas. And the second way, you need to do those curly braces. So you might be wondering, why in the heck would you ever do it the second way? Well, what the second way is good for is when you need to set multiple properties at once, which is not actually that uncommon. So you can see in the third example, which I'm greatly struggling to get my cursor going with, is you see how in that one we're setting the font weight and the padding. And so you can see those two sets of different properties that we're addressing in one call to that function are separated by commas. And at this point, you're like, I think you could probably sympathize with me. And then I say, oh my gosh, I get these things all crossed up all the time. So let's say in that example I have, I want to apply a 1 pixel solid red border to each paragraph, and I want to change the H1s to purple font. All right, so that's my mission. So I want to select all of the paragraphs and give them a solid red border, and I want to get all the H1s and make their font purple. All right, that's where I'm at right now. So let me show you what that looks like. It looks like this. Here's one. All right, so this right here, $P is a string. That is how you select all of the paragraphs in the document. One line, and I'm calling that CSS function, and I want to make the border 1 pixel solid red. Think about CSS when you're doing this. This would be the property you're setting, and that would be the value. And when I save this and I load this up, I get 1 pixel red borders around my paragraphs. That right there is, in my opinion, we've already proved that there's usefulness for this, because I don't think that would have been as easy to do in JavaScript. Now, you know how I said there was 2 ways we could do things? Well, here's the other way we could do the exact same thing. So notice, same selector, $, selector is a string, CSS. Now, here's that other way of doing it, just where instead of a comma, I have a colon, and they're wrapped in curly braces. This is not worth doing this way. The only reason I would think you would ever want to do the whole curly brace thing is if you want to set multiple properties, which there is a time and a place for that, and that would save you from having to do 2 lines as opposed to 1. However, I would have something to say to the effect of, if you're setting multiple properties, are you sure you don't want to just mess around with the class? I would. All right, so that's a bad demonstration because it looks like nothing happened, but you can see in my source code that I commented it out, so it's the same thing. Now the other part was I said I wanted all the H1s to be purple. So here's how I select the H1s. .css color purple. Wonder what those comments are for. All right, and then I uncomment that, and that's my H1, and now it's purple. So far, pretty similar to what you would do in JavaScript, really. I mean, it wasn't terribly difficult in JavaScript to manipulate the CSS of something. I don't think this is any easier, but I do like how I can select things. And it only gets better when you start getting to more complicated things. So, filters, right? So first, last, odd, even. Let me show you. So let's say I want to make the font color navy in the last paragraph. So you saw me select all the paragraphs. Let's select just the last paragraph, and I'll show you what that looks like. I don't know. I hate just uncommenting things. Do you know how much I want to write this code right now? I just worry that it's going to go over an hour, and I have found that when my videos get much above 50 minutes, it's like exponential how much more time it takes to render it. So here I go. There's one of those pseudo selectors, so P last. And I'm going to give that one a border, which is solid green. I don't know what I said I was going to do in my example, but the point remains the same. And my last one now has a green border on it. So, like I said, if you're good at CSS, you're going to love these selectors because that's exactly how they work. If you're not good at CSS, well, what a great time to have some motivation to get better at them. All right. So this is one of the things that grinds my gears about jQuery. It's also necessary. So when you select something using those selectors, which is pretty much most of what we talked about so far, it returns a jQuery object. And so jQuery object, like an input or something like that, they don't have values. In JavaScript, we say, like input one dot value, and that's how you see what is in there. We used a lot of that for data validation last week. In jQuery, if you want to get the value of something, you have to call the val function. So it's good to understand and kind of keep in mind that when you're talking jQuery, you're talking jQuery objects, and you have to work with them a little bit differently than you would work with them in JavaScript. So, I don't know, here's an example. I don't know that I have a good one in my lecture, but this right here would create a variable called name, and I'm setting it to the value of whatever is in the thing with an ID of name. Like I can't type here, but in plain old JavaScript, that would be name dot value, right? But here I have to call a function, and that function is absolutely a getter, basically, is what that is. I don't know if I have an example, but I'm going to make one if I don't. Oh yeah, that's what this stuff was right here. So here's where I selected so I created a variable called word, and it's set to the value of word, and then I'm logging it's set to the jQuery object of word. It's an ID, so it's only going to be a single thing, and that's the value of that thing. Right? In JavaScript, it'd be dot value like that. I'll try that. I don't exactly know what it's going to say, but it's undefined, right? That's what that is. It says undefined. Let me get rid of this junk because it's just cluttering up our console. Not that I plan to use our console much, but it'll be easier to see what's going on here. So you see undefined, right? And the issue is that value is not a property of you can't access a jQuery object like that. But what you can do is call that val function, which will get the value of that thing, and it'll spit out DFG down there. So val versus value. You're going to trip over that probably because you're going to be used to writing dot value, but recall that if you're working with something that you fetched using jQuery selectors, you're going to need to use that val function. That's a slippery one. All right, so events. At this point, you can see we really are just getting to a functional knowledge of this. I'm kind of trying to give you the tools that I gave you for JavaScript in jQuery. Oh gosh, my time's going long. All right. So one of the annoying things about this is that these all have slightly different names than they would have had in JavaScript. So like here's the submit event for a form, and the syntax of this is pretty nasty. So there's events like blocus for okay. I'm leaving that in for sure. Blur and focus and change. You remember in JavaScript, those things might be called blur or focus, and they might be called on change, on blur, on focus. In jQuery, that's just going to be the thing, dot, the event, and then in here, something. That something is pretty darn messy. It's going to be an anonymous function call, and I've already talked about it a little bit, so you'll see it soon enough. All right, so this is going to lead to our first real example. So the next thing we're going to talk about before we even get to events really is talking about the each method. So this is a very important tool that we have in jQuery. In jQuery, we select things and we get arrays, right? Like all the paragraphs, all the H1s. Sometimes you saw that we wrote a rule to affect all the paragraphs a minute ago, but sometimes you need to actually have some logic in there, not just indiscriminately making them all green or something. And in that event, you're going to need this each function. So it looks like this. So this right here would select every paragraph and then dot each. And it's weird, right? Because it is a for each loop, but it's a function the way it's implemented. So it goes like this. So for each element, or for each paragraph is kind of how this is going to work. This anonymous function call, it's an inline function. This, and right, and you're seeing that this operator, you've seen that in PHP as well. That's just, I mean, right, let's say you got 20 paragraphs. They don't all have unique IDs. The first time through, this is going to be the first paragraph, and then the next time through, it's going to be the second, then the third, then the fourth. So this .css color red. So this would, well, that's not exactly valid because I'm missing some backticks there, but this in theory would make every paragraph red, and it would go through and do it one at a time. Now you might be wondering, why in the heck would you do this? Couldn't you just go use this selector and then say CSS color red? Yes, you could, but if you want to actually have some logic in here, which you will, like I'm going to do down below, then you're going to need the each function. So let's say I want to use the each method to make the text in every non-blank green field green upon submission. All right, so this is very complicated in terms of where we just jumped to. So I want to select all of the text boxes on the form. I want to look at them, and if they are not blank, I'm going to make them green. But I also am saying this upon form submission. So it's implied here that the event that we're working with here is the form submit event. And we also need to do that whole return false thing, because if we don't return false, our form's going to submit, and we'll never see anything turn green. So, jumping on down. Yeah, fine, I'll leave that stuff. Here's my document ready. So that's one event, right? This is that thing that happens when the DOM loads. I'm going to throw this alert in here for Leroy Jenkins, just because I always do that, to be honest with you, because it's easy enough to make mistakes. I like to know. That's what I do. When I start every time I'm doing a jQuery, because sometimes you can manage to not import the library or do something silly. I always throw an alert inside of here, just to make sure that I haven't screwed up yet. Because if I get that alert, that means I've got jQuery going. That means I've properly defining the load event for my form, and then I just get rid of it later. So I said we were going to do some each. All right, so don't worry, we'll come back to that stuff. So here's my submit. So this is what happens when you submit my form. Notice here's my return false at the end. This is basically what that means. So here's what I'm defining. What happens when you press the submit button on the form is what this means. And here's that nasty syntax. So my form.submit, and here's that anonymous function call, right? Empty parameters. I open my curly brace closes here. There's that closing parenthesis, which matches with that, which is pretty hard to look at. And there's the semicolon. This is a very uncomfortable set of 3 characters to look at, but that's just what it is. That is correct. And so I said what we were going to do is we were going to go through and look at every input, right? So I select all the inputs, and I use that in conjunction with this call to this each. Each is yet another anonymous function call, right? There's that opening parenthesis, there's that opening curly brace, there's that closing curly brace, there's that closing parenthesis. Kind of nasty, right? That's the most painful thing to deal with. So this just means, what this really means is fetch all the inputs, iterate through them, and then here's my logic. If this thing's value is nothing, how about not nothing, then make it green. Now that's all I said to do. I will mess around with this later. And if you're wondering how am I going to get through all the rest of this in 15 minutes, well, I might not, but I'm somewhat hopeful. So that's what I asked to do. And so let's see how this goes. So when I press submit, right, because that's what I'm doing, is I'm defining the submit, it made the non-blank ones green. Now here's the weird thing. If they're blank, there's nothing to color another color. So I don't know that they're not green. It's also pretty annoying that the button is green, but hey, a button is an input. You might be wondering, how do I like to deal with that? Well, I like to give my inputs that I actually want to validate a class, so I can use a pseudo selector on them. All right, if you don't love that yet, that's okay. We'll do better. So I covered that. That's how each works. So I iterate through all of them. I looked at each one of them, and that's a good example of why you need the each function. Because if you got logic, I mean, if all you're doing is making them green, well, fine. You don't need this. But if you want to actually take an action based on what's in them, then you're going to need that each function. All right, next. So this is some cool stuff. So now we're talking about prev and next. Prev and next are jQuery functions which are used to select the previous and the next thing in the DOM. So on those inputs, the previous element on all those inputs is that label. The next thing is not so easy to deal with. Next is the label of the next thing, which is not what you want. But I'm just showing you right now, rather than get all weird with this, I'm just showing you the syntax. So .prev is a function which will return the previous element in the DOM. And next will grab you the next thing in the DOM. This is very useful. We will use a lot of this. You'll see that all my examples, well, several of my examples use this stuff. But this is how you can select the previous and the next thing in the DOM. It's very cool. So you got prev and next, which are used to select elements in the DOM. And the other thing you have is after and before. Before and after sound very similar, but what they do is they add something to the DOM before or after. So prev and next are used to select those things. Before and after are used to create them. So like this right here would be, so I don't know what this is a reference to. It's a reference to whatever it is. I don't know. There's no context here. dot after, and then after I'm just doing some pure HTML here. So this will create a div with a class of stuff and some text that says text after whatever this is referencing. And if you had that be before, then it would put something before it. It's pretty cool. And remove is kind of, I don't know if it's related, but I do use it in conjunction with it. Remove means, hey, so you select the thing and you call remove, and remove will pull that thing out of the DOM. So before and after are used to add things to the DOM, either before or after the element, and remove is used to remove the element. This is cool stuff. It's kind of hard to appreciate from a distance, but let's do the heart of the examples for the day. So the first thing I want to do is display a hint for the word field. So the focus of it. All right, whatever. So I want to do a hint on the word field. So that is going to be up in here. It's not on submit, right? Like hints are not something you're going to do on submit. They're something you're going to do on load. And so here is that first example. So word, so when you focus on word, anonymous function, this dot after, I'm going to throw a span saying cannot be blank. So I'm using that after method, which means to create something in the DOM with a, right, saying that. This is really cool, right? It's better than making this text green. Let's see how this all works out. So I focus on it. Oh, got something. I screwed something up on 66. I'm sure it's something. Yeah, exactly. What in the heck was I even trying to do? Not clear. Sorry. Commenting this stuff out's a project of its own. I'm going to try and make this not go right so we can get some work out of it. So I focus on it. It says cannot be blank. Cool. Great, right? Really neat, right? Problem is I keep doing this, right? Every time I focus on it, I get another one. And this is the kind of problem with adding things and subtracting things from the DOM. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So how the heck do we deal with that? Well, so the issue is for a hint, you don't just want to keep adding them when you focus. You also need to remove it when you blur it. So that was this mess here that I was dealing with. So here's me adding the hint after. And then when I blur it, this is a little more complicated. So this is a reference to that. And so I'm saying, hey, the thing after it, which is next, right? Next is used to select the next thing in the DOM, which is going to be that div that I created on focus, and I want to remove it, right? This seems weird. Function call, function call. But this right here, I mean, it's a guarantee that if I focus on it, I'm going to have a span after it. And this means that next is going to be a reference to that span, and that's going to remove it. And this is cool. This is high-level usability for a form, right? That's awesome. That's great. I mean, you could do persistent errors and such, but that's very helpful in terms of a hint and pretty easy to implement. So that was example 1. Example 2 is, all right, so write a rule which will change the font color to each label, right? So we haven't done this before, but it's pretty cool. To red for each input of a class if required on submit if empty. All right, so what is that? I wrote this sentence. It's kind of messy. So I'm saying on submission of our form, what we want to do is we want to go through all of our inputs with the class if required, and we want to color the label, accordingly. So that's going to be down in here on my submit, right? So, when I went through before and I made the color of the thing green if it was good. Well, what I'm going to do now is a little different. I'm going to comment that out. I'm going to iterate through all of the inputs. And this time I only care about the ones that are required. So you see I gave them a class of required. That'll stop me from looking at my input button. And you haven't seen me do that yet. So let's do that. So I'm just going to say dot required. Right now I just got everything with a class of required. And so if that thing is empty, then I want to grab the previous element in the DOM, which is going to be that label, and I want to set the color to red. I'll show you kind of how that works. So I submit. I didn't do very good. I don't know what I didn't do. This.prev. Now that was a good one. This is a fun one. Let me show you how I fixed it. I haven't fixed it, but I was like, what is wrong here? Here's what I like to do. So required, right? I double clicked on it to select it, and that'll light up everything else on the page that says required. And I noticed that these aren't lighting up. It's because their class is required. I mean, that is like almost impossible to see. So I'm just sticking with required because I think it's funny. So I'm going to select things with a class of required. Yeah, right. That's one of the more interesting syntax error. I don't know. It's not a syntax error. It's logic error. So just do it, and those are red, which means I think I screwed something up. Oh, I did screw up. I know what I screwed up. It's that, right? So green, or what did I say? I already lost when I got debugging. I forgot what I was trying to do here. Okay, so red if they're required, if they're empty. All right, so that's just going to mean, so if it is empty, red. There we go. That was a little bit of a detour, but interesting. Oh, cannot define function call. I don't know what I did or how that would even possibly go wrong. What did I don't even know what I just changed. So I'm going to have to pause for a second. Right, so it says I cannot assign a function call. I know what that means because I've done it before. It means you instead of having an inequality there or a comparison, you have an assignment. And there we go. Cool, right? That's a nice way to give some easy feedback to your users. Could you pop a div over here or a span saying that you got a problem? Sure. Is that a better idea? Probably, but that's just what I did. Now the problem here is I go like this, I fix it, and it doesn't get fixed. You know this because you dealt with it in JavaScript. If you are going to be giving feedback when something's got a problem, well, you're also going to need the other half of that, which is going to be the else, which resets the CSS, right? So I'm just changing it to black if it's actually good. So let me make that not good. You see how it's stuck on red. See it's, yeah, that was a horrible demonstration because I forgot to press refresh until the very end, but I'm telling you, it works. Well, I think it works, right? So red, put something in it. Now it's fixed, right? So you got to reset that CSS. So when you're messing with CSS conditionally, you also need to fix it too. Now I'll show you a tool for doing that in a few more slides. So the last one. So like I said, that's the color scheme. Here's another one. Add an error div below each blank form field. Improve it like the previous example. So let's just say instead of making these things red and black, we want to do something like display some text on the screen, which is cool. So I will leave that there because I don't think there's any harm in it. And I will get this going here. So, okay, not that. Come back to that. So for every input, right, this just means iterate through all of my inputs with a class of required. If the value, if it has nothing in it, then instead of making the color red, I'm going to say, I'm going to use that after. So this, the thing that I'm looking at, dot after, create a span that says cannot be blank. I know in my example I said do a div. You could do a div. The problem with a div, and it's not really a problem, is that it's a block element and it's going to go below. And I don't care whether you want to do a div or a span. I kind of just like spans because they're right next to the field. Honestly, the problem with spans is depending on your CSS, sometimes there's not enough width for the span and they get all crazy, right? Like sometimes they get kicked down to the next line or something, but in this thing here, it's going to work okay. So very similar, just instead of doing some styling, I am creating a span tag informing the user of the error upon submission of the form. Nothing, 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 but I take out my favorite 4-letter word, and so when I press just do it, you see I get these error divs. This is not, I mean, this is what I wanted to happen. It's a fun error, right? At some point they start wrapping around. So do you see the problem is you can't just keep tacking things onto the DOM because otherwise things are going to blow up on you. What you need to do is come up with a scheme. And so when I said improve, like the previous example, that means what we need to do is find a way to, we got to get rid of those things, right? We can't just keep piling them on top of each other because that's kind of a disaster. right? I mean, that fixes it, but they never go away. So when do we get rid of them? My solution to that is just, how about that? So I gave these spans a class of error because I know that they are, you might have other span tags on your page, you might not, but the ones indicating an error message are those ones. And so how about before the each, so before I go through, I just remove them all. And so I essentially redraw them every time. So I remove them all here, which is, the scope of this is just inside this submit. I mean, if it makes you feel better, it would make me feel better to put it here, even though it's not really related to the other parts of the code. So I'm just saying we press submit, clean up all the error messages, and then redraw them. And that right there will be a solution to our problem. And now, you see, they're not stacking up. I mean, you don't see it, but they are getting removed and redrawn every time. All right, so that's that example. We're almost there, folks. All right, so append and prepend. These are very cool. I am not going to illustrate these in this video because I think we're going to end up right around an hour either way. These are all over that lab that you're going to complete this week. These are pretty cool, though. So we did before and after, right, to put things before and after something in the DOM. Append and prepend are used to add children to something to the DOM. So like the best example that I can think of is a list item, right? So you got a set of UL tags or OL tags, it doesn't matter what kind of a list it is, and then so .append will add things in between two tags as opposed to after them. So that's append and prepend. And the difference between prepend and append is prepend is going to be the first thing in the list, append will be the last thing in the list. Pretty cool, right? So you can add things inside of something, and lists are the application of that. Our lab for the week is creating a dynamic to-do list, so trust me, you'll get some experience with that. Class methods. So I'm not going to illustrate these in this video either. I think you probably could guess that I value them because I prefer using classes than setting a bunch of CSS attributes in line. But add class is a function you can use to add a class to an element. Now I just want to try and remind you of what this looked like in JavaScript. Do you remember in JavaScript this was not cool? It was like you had to concatenate onto the class list and you had to put a space in front of it, and then removing the classes was like a different function or different syntax. Do you remember? It was pretty painful. jQuery has addressed that the best they can. I mean, I don't know how much easier it can be than just calling add class and then the name of the class. Now the other thing that's really cool about jQuery is this toggle class, because the nature of JavaScript is that you are manipulating the DOM in the browser in real time. You're not probably going to be just applying classes. I don't think you're going to be doing a lot of that at all. What you're going to be doing is applying them and changing them, and so toggle class turns something on and off. So like let's say you had a class of error, right, where it made things red and bold. You could toggle that class, and it's smart enough to determine whether that class exists, and if that class exists, it's going to remove it. Again, this is one of those things we're going to use in the lab, so I'm not trying to illustrate it too much here, but I'm telling you this is awesome. I'm a big fan of this. Now, this here is something that we will mess around with in the future. So like next week when we start doing Ajax, we're going to do some toggle. I've got a cool project where we do that. Right now I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So toggle, I'll start by saying one of the things that jQuery is great at is animation of things. And so toggle is that, and slide toggle and animate. I'll show you what these do. So I've got this mysterious button on my form. I'm going to show you what it does. So toggle is used to display and not display things. So there's where's my mystery? Here's my mystery button. So I have this button here with an ID of mystery. So I select that button, on click, anonymous function call. I'm calling this toggle function. Now this doesn't really have anything to do with anything. I'm just showing you some cool stuff. I'm trying to get you excited about jQuery in addition to get you using it. So I'll show you what that does. That is applied to this mysterious button. That mysterious button applies to a div which wraps up all those paragraphs. So it toggles it on and off. Now just like kind of the cool stuff that you can do with jQuery, toggle is a function, and there's a lot of things you can pass it. You can pass it these animation speeds. Like slow is going to give you a better illustration of what it is. Right, so and that's a good example of toggling, right? Like toggle class turns a class on and off. This alters the visibility of something, and you see you can do cool stuff like that. At this point, you're probably like, wow, that was pretty neat. What's slide toggle? Well, it's pretty darn similar. In most cases, it's almost exactly the same. But jQuery does some cool stuff. All right, on. This is another one that is very difficult to talk about, and it's a big part of our lab this week, and we will be using it actually next week too. So the dot on, this is used to attach events to things that weren't on the DOM when the DOM was built. Right, so you know how we've been talking about like before and after and prepend and append, those functions which add things to the DOM. Well, think about this. What if you want to attach a click event to something, right? I mean, you select that thing and then you add a click event to it. But if that thing isn't there when the page is built, how do you bind an event to it? Well, you do that with this on function, and it's a part of the lab, so I'm not too worried about it. So, document, you're going to select the root document on. That's the event you're attaching. That's the selector for the thing that you're doing, and that's the anonymous function call, which defines what you're doing. You'll see this is literally exactly what we're going to write in the lab. It's hard to understand at this point, but its usage is to attach events to things that weren't in the DOM when the DOM was built. And when you are adding things to the DOM, you're going to need a function like this. Date picker. So this is the last thing I plan to really talk about, with one exception. So date picker, one of the cool things you might need is so if you got a form that looks like this and you're asking for a birth date, you need it to be a certain format, right? And it's a pain, right? I don't want people to do this. I don't want to do that. Is that a valid date? Is that how I want it? Is that going to work? Probably not. So one of the things that does exist in jQuery is the date picker. So I'm going to show you how that works. Gosh, I'm bound up on time right now. So jQuery. I'm going to go to jQuery's website. The jQuery UI is somewhere. It's that thing. So anyways, yeah, I'm out of sorts right now. So you remember when I was showing you those Google hosted libraries? I said you needed to put that in there, right? That's the style sheet and the thing you need for it. If you want to put a date picker on your form, it looks like this. So that's the name of the thing that you want to attach it to, and just dot date picker. That'll put a date picker on it. At this point, you're like, you haven't explained what a date picker is. Not too worried about it. You're going to see that in a minute. All right. Date picker. I'm trying to stick with what I said I was doing. There we go. This might go over an hour. I'm nervous, but okay. So I'm saying I want to put a date picker on the date field. At this point, you're like, what's a date picker? Well, you know, a week ago when I said those built-in types weren't so good because they don't consistently work. Well, this does consistently work. Now you're not relying on the browser to pop this up for you. You are relying on jQuery to pop this up for you, and this is going to work. If you are building a website that requires valid dates, then use a date picker so you can get well-formatted dates. Now, there's all kinds of customization that you can apply to this to make this date work for you. Like maybe you need a time. I don't know. I actually don't know about times, how that would work. But if you need to change the format of this date, you just need to look at the documentation. So the reason I went here's jQuery. One of the strengths of jQuery is its documentation. Here I am looking at the UI. Here's date picker, right? Here's the documentation for the date picker. View source is going to give me an example of how to apply it. The documentation is what I'm going to look at because we're going to visit this in a minute. So if you're going to use something from a library, you need to understand how to use that thing and how to modify it. And that's where the documentation comes into play. So like, let's say I got a generic date picker, which is what I have. Let's say I want to enable year selection. So what I mean by that is, isn't it annoying that I can't change the year? I know you've all seen date pickers on forms where you can't change the year, and it's annoying, right? Like I don't know, you're trying to book a travel thing or something, right? I mean, you need to go further out than that. So how the heck do we add that to our date picker? So that's why I pulled up this documentation here. So here's the stuff that it can do. So I want to change the year. What you got to do is, right, that date format, that's going to be how you're going to modify your date format. I'm not clicking on all these things. I don't have an hour, 2 hours. But I do think maybe I'm thinking like change year. I'm looking. I'm looking. I think maybe year range. No, I don't think it's that. I'm sorry. I just did this, but I already forgot how to do it. Show year or something. change. Sorry. This is how this actually goes in practice. Year range? No, that's for defining a range. I want to just allow the user to change it. I'm choking right now, right? Because I'm starting to get nervous about it. Change year. There it is. All right, so I click on that. And so you can see if you want to customize that date picker, you're going to wrap it in curly braces, and it's going to be change year, true. So curly brace. Right, there's that uncomfortable syntax again. It was change year, true. And right, that's how you customize these things. Now, when I load it up, I click on it, and now I can change the year. Cool, right? Another very common thing that you might want to do is like enable a minimum date, right? So if you've got a scheduling app, do you really want people to be able to select yesterday? How's that going to go for your accounting system? So probably not so well. So what if I want to minimum date, right? That looks good. I got lucky. Min date. Min date's weird. Don't ask me to explain this because I can't, but I do know how to use it well enough. These examples here, they're creating a new date object. I know that I can do, it's min date, it's a colon, so if you have multiple things here, they're going to be comma separated, and so it's min date. I just know if you do min date 0, that means today. That means you're not allowed to select anything in the past. Right? Today's the 29th. We're looking good. Now, just other stuff, you don't need to care, but like if I did, you know, -1, that means I would let someone go back to yesterday. So you see how I'm customizing this thing? Now the documentation is complex because this is a complex thing, right? So maybe you could go like +1 month. Now we're defining min dates, which is weird. I think min date is usually just going to be that 0, which is today. But I think what's more realistic is that max date. And so you see how there's these stringy things like +1m, +1w. So I'll show you what I would do for that. So I know, right? Well, I'm getting all carried away with date picker. Like if I go +1m, that's not going to work right. I know because I've done this before. Not so good. Right? Something's breaking down here. It's not working. The deal is if you're going to use those things like 1 month and 1 day, those are strings. You have to treat them like strings. And now I've made this thing so you can't select any. It actually allows you to select yesterday, but it only lets you go 1 week into the future. Pretty cool, right? I think it's cool. So that's date picker. That's an example of, you know, I've always sold JavaScript is that you cannot rely on your browser for functionality, but if you need guarantees, then you need to use jQuery because, or JavaScript or jQuery because you can guarantee that those things are going to work. Now the last thing I want to talk about briefly is regular expressions. Now, I am not here to add anything to this conversation that we didn't have last week. Regular expressions work exactly the same in jQuery as they do in JavaScript. The only difference is in JavaScript we go .value to get the value of a text box. In jQuery it's going to be .val, that function. But that thing that you used for JavaScript was just a value that you kind of passed to the regular expression. Like it didn't have anything to do with where it came from. So I'll show you an example of that email validator. So this is a mess. So here I'm saying on change, so when we change that email, anonymous function, here's me creating that regex rule, nasty, right? Here's me creating a reference to the value in that text box. I mean, this is how I called the regex, right? It's the regex rule.test and then the value you're passing it. No different than it was before. And so at this point, like, you see this change event's kind of interesting. It doesn't work the way you want it to work, probably. Change gets fired when you blur it. Well, if you change the value and blur it, that's when it fires. Just doing this, you see, because that's not valid. You see, it doesn't kick in until you do that. So the difference between a change and a blur is it really depends on whether the values were manipulated inside of the text box. So that's the change event. So today I gave you the tools that I think you need to do some pretty cool form validation. And so don't forget about the things you learned in JavaScript, because things like regular expressions, that didn't change. And you can use those tools when needed. You just have to know that you reference the objects slightly differently. That's the difference between JavaScript and jQuery, even though they are kind of the same thing. So hopefully that got you started. We're going to keep using this into next week, so you're going to get more familiar with this syntax as you go on your assignment that's due. If you already started working on it in JavaScript, I guess you can continue with that, but if you want to do it in jQuery, you certainly can. As you've seen, I showed you some tools which I think allow for some pretty slick data validation, right? With creating, messing with labels, creating spans after the elements. Um, so don't forget that all the general stuff you've learned about JavaScript is applicable here. It's just a little bit of transition to make them fit together. So hopefully you found this useful, and thanks for watching.